So, my name is Jess Jacques. I'm Secretary of BLSA, and I'm also the host of this tonight's event.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Malcolm. I'm a third-year law student at Quinnipiac University. I'm also the Director of Community Outreach for the Northeast region of the Black Law Student Association. Before introducing our panelists, we'd like to thank everyone for joining. We'd also like to ask all of our attendees to keep their mic off during the duration of the panel. We hope to close the discussion by 7:30 and leave the last 20 minutes open for guests to submit their questions. I will be in the chat hyping everybody up, and also just put your questions in the chat and I'll be moderating that.
And we'd also like to inform you that that BLSA has the pleasure of offering everyone a discount to an online bookstore called ivpress.com. To access this discount, visitors should enter the bookstore's website and enter the code TRUTH20 during their checkout. This discount was provided to us by Sheila Wise Rowe, the author of the book Healing Racial Trauma, The Road to Resistance. Sheila is also a counselor and a speaker who could not join us tonight, but she was kind enough to share this perk with us all. And we'll have the instruction, we'll have the links and instruction provided in that chat. And now, without further delay, I'd like to present our panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Carmen Black Parker. Dr. Parker is a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. I want to apologize to everyone for mixing that up in the flyer. So in addition to being a psychiatrist, Dr. Parker is also an assistant professor of psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. Outside of her work, Dr. Parker is also an outspoken advocate of racial justice and equality. Hi, Dr. Parker, if you give everyone a wave. That's Dr. Parker. And our second panelist is Dr. Tiffany Llewellyn. Dr. Llewellyn is a licensed social worker with extensive experience counseling patients who struggle with mental health. Dr. Llewellyn is also the founder of a faith-based organization that's committed to social justice reforms. Hi, Dr. Llewellyn. Welcome. Our third and final panelist is Pastor Dexter Upshaw Jr. Pastor Dexter is a next generation community leader, speaker, and entrepreneur. He pastors New Vision International Ministry, a thriving urban church on the west side of Bridgeport, Connecticut. The church currently owns a 65,000 square foot warehouse that is being developed as a business incubator, community center, and event space. And Pastor Dexter is also my personal pastor. Hi, Pastor Dexter, welcome. So now, to begin our discussion, our first question for you guys today, my first question for anyone who'd like to chime in, is what are some mental health issues that are common in the Black community, and where do they stem from? For anyone who'd like to chime in.
I can go ahead and start. I think when we talk about Black mental health, the diagnosis that we see across the field are really similar in our community. So we talk about depression, anxiety, and those are, I would say, the two most prevalent that we are seeing across our communities, particularly when we're looking at racial trauma or specifically Black mental health. And I think there are a lot of contributing factors to specifically depression and anxiety in our communities, racial trauma being such a huge triggering factor for Black individuals just merely living in a racist society, and the impact that racism is having on Black mental health creates a different way to think about mental health in our communities, a different way to be able to identify and assess. And when we talk about treating mental health diagnoses, and so then what does that continue to look like? When we look at substance abuse, when we look at suicidality, then we see racism's impact on Black mental health leading to a lot of other concerning overall psychiatric diagnoses. But I would say specifically to the conversation around racism, depression and anxiety seems to be incredibly prevalent.
If anyone doesn't have anything to add, I do have a follow-up to that. You mentioned depression and anxiety being prevalent. What are some ways, or how does depression and anxiety manifest itself in in members of the Black community, and what are some ways we can like identify like its symptoms?
It's careful. We need to be careful, especially for those of us who are in the mental health field, about drawing the line between Black mental health and mental health in general, because we have unique aspects of our mental health needs and struggles, but I don't also want to create the narrative that there's something inherently different to Black bodies and Black minds. So depression for us is depression for the same as anyone else. The language we use might differ. For older religious Black individuals, they might be able to say, my nerves are not, as well today, or I'm feeling stressed. But actually using the word depressed, especially in religious Black individuals, is often hard for us to do, partially because we have so much trauma that we have to cope with. It's hard to actually take an insight into how we're feeling because the pressure never stops, the obligations never stop coming. So it's the same core experience, but our language and the precipitating reasons can be different. I just always want to be careful that depression is depression, trauma is trauma, PTSD is PTSD, even if the causes and the language we use are different. And a lot of non-Black providers have a difficult time recognizing depression and trauma in our communities because our experiences aren't always understood by those who don't understand our troubles.
I think if I were to add to that, interestingly enough, when we look at the history of psychology and really look at that historical piece between anthropology and psychology, from its very inception, the field has been very Eurocentric, formulated and very much conceptualized based on one particular frame being white men's view of humanity, white men's view of the brain, white men's view of emotions. And within the framework from the very beginning, the Black human body and minds was never considered to experience the same levels of psychological distress or even really be considered human enough to have emotions. When we look at, specifically this book, Even the Rat Was White, and it really breaks down how from its inceptions, Black people's context, their realities, their emotions, and the ways in which mental health shows up in our communities and continue to be experienced has really been missing from the field of mental health and psychology in general. And I think it's really important for us to be able to identify that. One thing I hear a lot from my clients and just in the community work that I do, that stigmatization or that missing language to even be able to name the experiences for ourselves as mental health, as depression or anxiety, there are huge gaps there. And a lot of community members are hesitant to engage mental health practice because they fear, whether it's, realized or not, they fear not being understood. They fear not, finding space for themselves in this overall work. And I do think that there's work in the field of mental health, psychology, psychiatry, etc., to be clear about the ways in which the Black identity, the Black body, the Black mind has been erased historically. And what do we need to do to understand, like Dr. Parker is saying, that Black individuals experience psychological distress and all these different mental health diagnoses in many of the same ways as everyone else. And how can we humanize that in our work?
Mm-hmm. And I can speak just on the ground. I don't have the clinical perspective, but just being a practitioner on the ground, dealing with people week in and week out and having, hundreds of individuals and families, people are dealing with a lot of stresses. And I think it is important to note that everybody deals with stress. Everybody has sometimes emotional wellness issues and difficulties, and it does manifest itself differently, particularly when you're dealing with Black families, Black people, and the unique experiences that they have. What I find is that in general, people are anxious regarding the future. They have questions about achievement and success. Am I doing the right things in life? People are dealing with the trauma of things that happened in their past, unreconciled experiences with family members, abuses. In the most extreme cases, you're dealing with people who have been harmed and been hurt even in childhood. And even as an adult, they're carrying around these weights and these pains and these frustrations, and they manifest themselves in their inability to cope with relationships now. So whether we're dealing with adults who still have things that haven't resolved from their childhood, or I find myself as a pastor, having to do a lot of impromptu, counseling, conversations that start with text messages to, okay, we really should have a deeper conversation about this, from marriages that are dealing with, maybe one person who has some emotional challenges that they can't really deal with, all the way down to kids who are dealing with behavioral things, and parents trying to figure out what's the best path forward so that my child can be successful in school and grow up to be healthy. So we see it across the board in the church space. People are really dealing and wrestling with society. And to a certain extent, I don't see things getting better, especially with the advent of social media and the level of this kind of dopamine driven culture of likes and, comparison, and the 24-hour news cycle, and people just kind of being inundated with fear has really made it challenging on the ground to help people kind of overcome stuff.
My next question for anyone, there seems to be, in my opinion, it seems to be like a level of resistance towards the idea of like seeing professional help for a mental health issue in the Black community. Why do you guys think there's such a strong stigma against people with mental health issues in the Black community, and why are we so hesitant to seek help for mental health issues?
I think, and I can just share from my perspective, I think in a lot of ways people are asking for help. That help may not get to the point of going to a professional medical, it may not get to a medical point or to a clinical point. But I think people in my line of work, they ask for help in different ways. I find that there are barriers a lot of times to cost. There's a lot of ignorance concerning, when is it appropriate to seek therapy or counseling in a formal practice. I also find that it's hard sometimes to find counselors and therapists that people in my congregation can identify with. They have to be Black or Latino. It's hard to find counselors or therapists that fit that demographic. And then, I think sometimes it's also difficult for people just in general to kind of move beyond their initial feelings to say, okay, what steps should I be taking to get to a place of emotional health? I know personally, so a lot of people wonder whether or not there are pastors who are advocates for mental health and professional mental health. I can say within the work that I do, there are often times that we get to a point in counseling where we say, you know what, like you would benefit from, a therapist, you would benefit from a counselor. The problem is, who do you refer them to? And then once you do perhaps get a person that can refer, do they take insurance or do they not take insurance? I've had counselors that say, you know what, I can't really do the insurance thing because, it's really difficult for my practice. Okay, so now somebody's paying out of pocket a certain sum of money that they can't afford. So what happens is they might get started, but then they can't persist because they just can't afford it. Right. So I think those are some of the barriers that people have once they are enlightened to the point of saying, you know what, I could use some additional support.
To your point, I think Black communities are asking for help, just like you said. I also want to be careful because spiritual care has been a long-term bedrock of Black mental health resilience. When we couldn't go anyplace else, when we were discriminated, still ongoing with insurance access and lack of therapists who look like us. Personally speaking, I've been through a lot in the last year. When I found a Black therapist, personally speaking, I couldn't imagine going to a white therapist. There's so much of what I'm going through that I don't want to have to educate someone on. Like, well, no, yes, it is different to be Black in the community. Well, no, like I'm not here to educate my therapist. So that's one of the big hurdles. But spiritual care, is mental health care in so many ways. It's been scientifically validated. It helps with cognition. It helps decrease cortisol levels. It helps build community. It's actually something I published on recently. So if a client expresses more openness to spiritual care, as opposed to the traditional mental health professional route, not all issues can be dealt with by non-professionals. You know, certainly by the time you reach psychosis or addiction, the referral process becomes clear. However, for a lot of the trauma-related coping and resilience, spiritual care has absolutely been the bedrock of communities, and it works. I mean, we didn't need a scientific paper to tell us it worked, but eventually someone asked and it's there. But we've been doing it for centuries. Science just caught on in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I would add to that I see it in a couple different categories. One being the systemic issue around the history of distrust with the health system for many of our communities. And then two, thinking about only 4 to 5% of therapists are people of color or identifying as Black or Latinx. And so that's a really, really small population. And then there's certainly that cultural stigma as well that creates additional barriers where the language or who sought mental health has certainly been a part of our communities, right? Is it for crazy people, even as Dr. Parker mentioned, and Pastor mentioned around the use of religious circles or spiritual care, but on the other side of that as well, the impact that for some people, they mentioned the concept of praying it away has also been a hindrance for seeking mental health treatment. And so religious and spiritual care is kind of on both sides of that. And then there's that interpersonal piece about how am I even learning to name what I'm experiencing for myself, you know, and for a lot of individuals, and I think you asked this question earlier, is to what degree do we understand what the symptoms look like? So knowing that an ongoing sense of hopelessness and helplessness or increased fear and worry and stress, low self-esteem, to some degrees paranoia when we're looking at policing and some of these other traumatic impacts that directly impact our community. Flashbacks, low self-worth, dehumanization, you know, all these different symptoms, we have not always in our communities had the language to be able to name and categorize. And so a part of it is the educational piece as well. Just last night, I was on another panel at another law school talking about the importance of language. And how do we speak to not just our generations, but past generations as well, to begin to name these things for what they are and the challenge in being able to do so. So I very much see the barriers as systemic, cultural, religious, interpersonal. It's really a mixture of all these realities that I think have created or sustained the ongoing stigmatization in some ways. But what I really appreciate and agree with is that in our communities, seeking help or receiving that support looks differently. Our context is different, our frameworks are different. And I think that's one of the capitals that we have, right? Is that we don't have to fit into the traditional one-on-one therapy box, although that can certainly be beneficial for many people. But how can we also think about some of those non-traditional capital that we hold that have always built our resilience and our strength and helped us to cope as a community as well?
I guess as a follow-up question to what you just said, Dr. Llewellyn, would you guys say, is the mental health community culturally equipped to address the traumas and issues that are sensitive to Black men and women? And is it proper to differentiate the treatments applied for Black mental health issues from treatments that's commonly used for other races or ethnic groups?
That's one of the interests I'm looking in right now. So are we equipped? I think there's a lot of good intentions, and I think that the culture is now more than ever ready to learn and grow. But if we took a test today, would it be pass or fail? I'm not, the prognostics are not looking good. Reasons being is, you know, we're calling it a racism pandemic right now, but we've been saying it for centuries, right? So to Dr. Llewellyn's point that the whole foundation of psychiatry was written with this male Eurocentric perception of how everyone else should be or behave, and undoing that, not only was it constructed, but deconstructing those deeply ingrained biases is going to take decades of very intentional work. I took my psychiatry boards last week, and I can tell you some of the test questions I came across made me nauseous. Literally, we had women who got raped while walking downtown as the stem of the question. So it wasn't someone who was assaulted at a frat party in Wisconsin. She was assaulted while walking in the middle of downtown at night. One question had Mr. Le Hobo, and Dr. Med Pusher. So there's just so much, and this was like the national certification for psychiatry boards. A Black person didn't write that. So is the system prepared? No, because we have to deconstruct before we can reconstruct with more appropriate balance. And shout out to my colleagues who are here tonight, because there really is a willingness amongst providers to do that work. And I'm thankful for them, because there's a lot to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There is a lot of work to do. Race has been such a subject of discomfort. I mean, even outside of our field, just in general for many people. So bringing race even into clinical work has been even more uncomfortable. And I have learned that through a lot of the trainings that I do with mental health agencies. We're talking about even in schools, even in religious places, like it's everywhere, right? And so what are the safe spaces that Black people can show up and be fully seen? And that has not always been a reality. And not even on that level, but when I do work with certain agencies and I ask to see the assessment tools and I ask to see the metrics and the rubrics that's used to conduct assessments, oftentimes missing from a lot of even the assessments is a conceptualization of Black racial identity or the Black experience. And so not just for the clinicians in the room doing the work, but even the tools that's being used to evaluate and create diagnosis and create treatment plans are often still void in that way. And so for, whatever reason, 2020 has really lit that fire in a lot of industries to move towards being more competent in these ways. And so I am more hopeful for the field to come than the field as it is. But I do have a lot of colleagues and peers who do the work who are open and, really have that hunger to learn. And so that I think really adds to my optimism for what mental health will look like going forward. And so hopefully it also helps to impact our communities.
After reading that question, Dr. Parker, I'm reminded of a story you shared one time of a man who walked into a clinic and he was kicked out. I don't know if you're comfortable sharing.
I share that story as often as I can. So my first residency, I was the only Black resident to go there in a span of 5 years. So out of 60 hires, I was the chocolate token, and no Black faculty existed for a training program. So to the point, is medicine ready? If we don't, Black faculty in psychiatry are 3% of providers and faculty. There's not enough of us to go around to do this work on our own. So another problem in psychiatry in particular is the insurance card that Pastor Upshaw mentioned originally. A lot of institutions only take privately insured, especially if you're in a training hospital. The faculty are locked behind ivory towers of privately insured, which by virtue of 400 years of barriers means you lose a lot of the Black and brown people. So we had in our resident clinic every week, we all sat down together. There was a racially ambiguous 19-year-old kid who was referred over from neurology. He was literally the color of, builder tan walls, completely ambiguous. You couldn't identify him readily as much of anything. And the neurologist said that his PTSD from a gunshot wound was making him not sleep, and this lack of sleep was making his seizures worse. So being comprehensive, holistic, caring providers, they referred him over to psychiatry, because if you help the PTSD, then you'll sleep better, then your seizures will get better. But because the faculty were so unused to urban trauma, as this young man had very guarded posture, the first thing he said is, "You won't understand me." But he still came, right? And he never showed emotion until he started talking about the actual gunshot incident. And the way he described it, he was making the gun sign because he was reliving it in his mind. And he said that, "I was just trying to get to the other side of the street. They pulled out the gun, they shot me in the arm. I couldn't run to the hospital. The hospital was in their direction and they would have killed me. But my friend had a gun. Why didn't my friend shoot back? So I'm running away from the hospital. Why didn't the friend shoot back?" And because these providers are completely ill-versed in any trauma, this young man, he was born to a father who was incarcerated. He was having a mom addicted to crack. He got in fights in school. He stole to eat from Wawa once, but he gave it back. But the providers said, "Wow, he showed no remorse while he was talking about his life." Well, Black communities, they struggle a lot with urban trauma and violence and absent fathers. But he's been so inoculated in this violence, the only time he got excited was talking about the violence. And so it was very clear that he was a sociopath because he had to enjoy it. He didn't cry, he showed no emotion. So they kicked him out of clinic, saying, "We don't have enough security for a Black sociopath." The whole time they were giving this vernacular of false cultural competency. Well, it was very clear that he, as a young Black man, they're assigning Blackness to him because he was poor and in the urban trauma. Again, he was the color of a light bulb. He could have been much of anything. But because he was poor and a sociopath, now they're using their Black vernacular of competency to describe his life. Well, those in trauma, you can't help a sociopath. And look, when we told him that it was our clinical recommendation, he could get much better services at the state facility down the street. They've got better security. I mean, a caseworker, he really needs a caseworker, but they've got better security down there. So it was our clinical recommendation that this young man be referred to this non-affiliate, non-PIN clinic that could offer him better resources. And so as they were being wildly biased in the moment, they had this group think choo-choo train of cherry-picking little reasons, loosely affiliated, and not questioning their clinical rationale. So, this young man had been in neurology for 5 years, no problems. If he had trauma, you could have looked it up, you could have called a provider. But the way bias works in the moment is the more courses we take on being racially just, the harder it's going to be to catch it in the moment when you're doing it. The more you learn about it, the harder it is to identify because it gets more taboo each time it happens. So if we're not careful, if we don't infuse the language of what racism looks like in the moment and make it okay to identify, it's just going to manifest in all these cherry-picked reasons as we assign Black sociopathy on this poor kid who at 19, for him to even show up to the appointment was a triumph that we failed.
To digress a bit in like some earlier comments that you made, I remember Pastor Dexter, you mentioned and you mentioned being willing to like recommend counseling for your attendants. And Dr. Llewellyn, you mentioned how like I guess in passing how in the church there's this concept of like that prayer alone is enough to I guess cope with like mental health issues. My question to that is, does the church discourage Black people from seeking professional help or mental health issues? And is having faith in God and seeking mental health care from experts something that's unbiblical or mutually exclusive?
That's a great question. And I think it's important once again to delineate that mental health challenges happen across race, right, and ethnicity. And that what might be seen as a challenge, quote unquote, in the Black church might actually be a greater thought in the greater like church community, not just like Black churches, but then also depending on what denominational thread you're in. For example, if you happen to be more Pentecostal, there's more of an emphasis on prayer as a solution. There are some folks who are much more extreme in their expression of faith, who see God as healer and basically would rather, pray than, let's say, take medicine. So I think there's a gradient or a range of expression just across Christianity. There's also a range of expression across kind of Black church Christianity, right? Which is definitely not a monolith. And I think as a pastor, one, I can only really speak for myself. And a lot of what I try to do is to delineate the difference between myth and then misconception. A myth is sometimes a widely spread false belief or false idea, that becomes common and people just kind of repeat it. But then if you kind of look at the data and say, well, there's really nothing to really substantiate what people are saying, it becomes almost like, something that's just assigned to a group of people because that's what you say about this particular group. And I think for the ills of, the church, we have our issues, we have our problems. I think you'll find more often than not, particularly in the urban communities for pastors that really care, these are issues that we wrestle with. These are issues that we really work to try our best with integrity to do what's best for our people and the people in our congregation. And I think there is a very extreme view about just, kind of quote unquote praying things away. I think that as it's been stated, the church in many respects is on the front lines of mental health and emotional health, because every week, depending on the size of your church, you have sometimes tens, sometimes hundreds of people. You have families. And so we're deeply entrenched in the work of people, right? People's health and wellness, helping people work through trauma, and using our scriptures as a sacred text and a sacred foundation for which we approach and have a worldview. So for us, I would first say that the space of worship can be viewed as a therapeutic space. I think sometimes it gets accused of being an escapist space, which I don't necessarily agree with. But I believe that there's health and coming together within a community. There's health in coming to a place of shared community. There's health in coming to a space and having relationships. There's health in coming to a space where you have extended family, where you're not isolated. All these things kind of go into this community to really do a lot of work within people to help them with their mental health and with their emotional health before they get to a place where they really do have to find themselves in an emergency situation. As a pastor, I deal with it all. I've been in situations where my wife and I were driving from New York and I get a call that someone was supposed to show up to a rehearsal. They didn't show up, literally like, okay, somebody needs to go to her house. I'm on the phone while that person has a key, is going in. That person's passed out because they took something more than they need to take, and literally walking through the process. Okay, let's get her to the hospital. Let's go. I'm the first person there, right? When she opens her eyes, those are the type of scenarios that I find myself in. Unfortunately, as a pastor, ranging from that to, to counseling, to, walking people through grief, through trauma, through difficult situations. I think the key is, for the perspective of faith, there is this sacred belief and this sacred understanding in God as healer. That's part of our language and that's part of our culture. And that's part of our experience, our shared experience. You do have people, for instance, my own mother, she's dealt with stage 4 cancer. She went to the doctor. The doctor gave her a prescribed course of action, which my mom was cool with. She went through her chemo, she went through this, she went through that. But the perspective of the doctor, maybe it was a cultural thing, was very negative. Told her that she only had a short period of time to live. My mom was like, nope, that's not what the Lord told me. So yeah, she went through her chemo, she went through this, but then she went through the process of finding supplements so holistically her body could heal. She went through the process of, you know, saying, okay, the Lord is telling me my husband needs to anoint my liver, right? And pray for it, you know, every night, every day. She went through the process of following like scripture and praying and encouraging herself. And I believe for her, that was the difference. So I think sometimes it's posited as either or. And I think of some extreme circles, like yes. I think more practically, most of us as pastors, we're negotiating between both worlds. When people have a physical issue, we're saying, yes, like you need doctors. God has placed doctors in the earth with specific information to be able to help with things that we don't know about, we don't understand. As you walk into that doctor's room, don't set your faith aside. In fact, prayer, belief is important to your process of recovery. And then I know there is scientific data that shows if someone walks into a hospital room and they're told they have some type of terminal illness, their attitude, their mentality concerning that thing, their emotional standing on if they'll survive. Once you've lost the will to live, then the physical doesn't respond well. So faith is important for people, and in my space, it's a holistic worldview that's not segmented. I think the key is, once again, you know, how do we develop the type of partnerships with the health community, with the psychological community, with the psychiatric community, that we can kind of be on the front lines and know when someone really does need medical professional help, right? Because it's not always readily, you know, evident. I also believe it's important for us to create therapeutic communities to help families become therapeutic spaces, because a lot of the difficulties that people are dealing with, they do stem from sometimes people not having a knowledge on how to live skillfully, right? How do I deal with conflict? How do I overcome a challenge? Resiliency is something that it seems like is getting less and less. People are less and less resilient than they were, let's say, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. And I think part of the polarizing culture, the 24-hour news cycle, my own personal belief, you know, social media, all these things are kind of eroding at this sense of resilience and kind of that reality of life. And I believe the church is important because we are in the front lines of helping equip people to live life skillfully, to live life in love, to be able to treat, you know, their families and to resolve conflict and to love one another and to, you know, have a process to deal with the difficulties of life. And then us figuring out, okay, what are those moments where we do need professional help and being able to make those referrals. So once again, I find myself in situations where it's like, okay, who do I turn to? You know, where do I go? Where are the resources so that we can help people, you know, overcome the challenges that they have?
Now, I don't know if anyone wanted to add to that, but I have also a question I was going to ask, which is, my family's Haitian, my family's from the Caribbean, and I guess as a Black family, my family, or I noticed that like in the West Indian community and in a lot of Black families, we take a lot of pride in ourselves in being stoic, independent, and resilient. In your opinions, is this a contributing factor in why we hesitate to seek mental health? And are Black men less likely to seek mental health care from professionals than Black women?
Based on personal experience, your question is a bit bittersweet. Because think of the example of the 19-year-old kid who actually did show up for help. So Black folks have a lot of legit reasons why it might sound like seeking help is the gold standard and what to do, but my heart gets anxious and worried about what medicine's going to do to our people should we show up at their door. where I currently work, there's armed police at the front door. And we're the safety net community state funded institution to serve Black and Brown communities. So as your family members come to us, are they even going to make it past the representation of oppression at the front door? I don't know. Within the doors, we do our best. At the door, I don't know. So is that a factor? Stoicism, cultural reasons, yes, but I also, my heart breaks to think of all of the ways at times medicine mistreats our people.
Yeah, when I think of the West Indian community, and I laugh because being Trini myself, and being very, very familiar with my people and all our neighboring islands, that I can certainly see as a contributing factor. The idea, particularly if you are, first, second generation, your parents migrated here, endured the whole immigrant struggle, and did whatever it took to be able to take care and create and achieve this American dream. And so the idea of fear, worry, stress, these things being valid, these things being considered, emotional experiences that deserve to be acknowledged and, processed and treated, it's in many cases is not viewed in that way. It's, I just kind of did what I had to do, and we just kind of take on this persona of pushing through and making it through anything, and you just kind of have to keep going and going despite the weight that the immigrant experience brings. And so I do think that the way in which we think about emotions, if we think about it in many West Indian communities, is in and of itself a barrier. And I work with a lot of my students who are trying to explain to their parents why they're coming to the counseling center at the university, or having to hide from their parents that they are going to therapy because they're often told, what do you mean you're depressed? You're not depressed. You're not anxious. Like, you don't even know what these things mean. And so just the understanding or affirmation is often missing in a lot of our communities. And that's a part of the re-educational process, right? And even as the pastor talked about the role of the church, I work with a lot of my pastors in my denomination to utilize the pulpit to do a lot of that reframing and re-educating for particularly in West Indian communities, so that they can start to close the loops around emotional, psychological health, physical health. All these things have been compartmentalized in our communities in a lot of ways, and we need to close the loops so that we begin to not just have that push it through mindset. I think when it relates to Black men or Black women and who seeks therapy more, I don't necessarily know what the breakdown looks like in that way, but I do know that some of the research shows us, specifically drawing out Black men, that, they feel like living requires a lot of effort, a lot of the time. That's some of the language that I've pulled out of research. And I'm sure it can be very much measured the same way for Black women. The reality is that when compared to our counterparts, we are not seeking therapy in the same way, at the same rate, and with the same prevalence, because there's just a lot of hesitation to just kind of sit in that emotional distress and give language, again, in a lot of the other things that we talked about. So I don't know who's seeking therapy more or less. I just know that as a community, we are seeking therapy less than how often we are experiencing it. We know that Black individuals, based on the research, report about 20% more psychological distress than any other community. But the rates at which we seek psychological treatment is much less than any other community. And so the gaps are certainly there, whether we're talking about Black men or Black women.
I think I definitely agree with both of your assessments. And, I'll say this, historically, we have been a strong people. And that's documented, almost to our detriment. And, you know, when you look at even going back to slavery and the unique brand of American slavery that was different than slavery in other places in the world, there was always this sense of this people is a strong, resilient people who can withstand this climate and, you know, can produce in X, Y, and Z. So I believe that there's a resiliency that is embedded within our culture, right, and our legacy. It's not always a bad thing, but it can be. You know, when I look, I'm not, you know, from the Caribbean, or I don't have Caribbean roots or African roots, but in the sense of first, second, third generation. But, you know, when I look at the narratives of both of my family, both branches of my family tree, my grandfather was the son of a sharecropper. You know, he grew up in Mississippi. My father was one of, I think, 9 kids. You know, his parents never got more than a high school education. You know, his dad was in the military, so my dad was an Army brat. You know, I don't know who my paternal grandfather is. You know, my maternal grandfather. You know, my mom grew up in a household, you know, 8 siblings, 8 of them total. You know, her grandparents, you know, lived on a farm out in Arkansas, Blevins, Arkansas, right? You know, when they tell stories about things that they did, I'm amazed at how they did so much with so little. I mean, every single summer, my mom would get dropped off, you know, in the country, you know, with the rest of her first cousins, and they would just survive for like 3 months with no, you know, running water, no, you know, I mean, like literally the house still stands that my great grandfather built with his own hands. So there's a level of resilience that I think is indicative of those who came before us. I also think that there was a different age, and we just have different challenges nowadays. My grandfather on my father's side, his father, grew up and never heard his father when he was growing up say, "I love you." That was his experience. My grandfather was a military man. He definitely wrestled with his struggles and had a turnaround with faith much later in his life. I'm a 3rd generation pastor. My father started preaching before my grandfather did. But it wasn't in the language and the culture of my grandfather to say, "I love you." My dad never heard it when he was growing up. As a response, my dad and my mother decided that in our house, we're going to have a culture where we say, "I love you," where affection is shown, where if you're feeling a certain type of way, you express it. Let's talk about it. Those are therapeutic, healthy cultures that were intentionally embedded like in our home to help us not just be resilient, but to also be in an emotionally healthy place. I say that to say that I think some of it comes from a cultural era as well, as you move from a very like kind of industrial like era. You know, I find all the time with baby boomers and above, they came from a very like, you know, you just do what we say, like period. There's no conversation. It's top down leadership. It's this, it's that. Someone tells you to do something, you do it. To a culture now, the world just doesn't work that way. And I think some of that resilience comes from that era and those hard times and those difficult times. I think for Black men, you know, I think we have our challenges, and I think there are some cultural reasons for that. I think there's some societal reasons for that. I think there are some misconceptions about what manhood is and what it looks like that play into sometimes the kind of strong, silent type. But once again, we know that, you know, we're dealing with stuff and having spaces to be able to express, to have conversation, to be able to talk honestly, you know, to be able to cry, to weep, and understand that's not a detriment to your manhood. This is an expression of humanity. You know, I think being able to deal with that at the community level in spaces like churches and community groups helps to kind of break some of that ice. But I also instinctively, I don't think it's just, you know, I think we have a disproportionate amount of weight that's sometimes on our shoulders because we are trying to be the quintessential. You know, when I went to college, I was the first person in my family to go to Ivy League. My parents were one of the first just to go to college, period. But now you're on campus. It's not just about getting your books. You're trying to do well for the community. You're trying to do well back home. Everybody's going to be asking you, how's it going? You know, you can't go back and you struggling. And they're like, well, you're supposed to be representing the community. You got all this on your back, and it's not just going to class. Even as a pastor, I have more suburban counterparts. You know, they spend their whole week working on their sermon on Sunday. Like, I'm counseling, I'm going on rescue missions and all type of stuff. There's a lot of burden on our back. But I don't think it's completely unique to us. I just think culturally, it just manifests in different ways.
If I can just add to the concept of resilience in our communities, I think it's one that's certainly worth exploring deeper when we talk about mental health in Black communities. I wrote an article titled Black Does Crack, because I know that we hold on often to this idea that Black people are strong and resilient and push through. But when we look at Black, not just mental health, but physical health from the concept of this term called weathering, what we see that racism, or living in a racist society, dealing with discrimination, dealing with centuries of oppression and, you know, colonization, etc., not just historically, but currently, and the ways in which it is literally impacting Black people's physical health. This idea of how we practice resilience at the expense at times of our mental and psychological health, and it is not doing us any favors. When we look at high blood pressure, obesity, cardiovascular issues, I mean, you pick a physical or medical condition, and what a lot of us in racial trauma research is identifying is the weight of and this toll that it's taken on Black bodies, on Black minds. If we even look at the brain in and of itself, from the, you know, prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the hippocampus, all these aspects of our brains and our bodies that are in constant ongoing stress and tension as we navigate and push through to be the resilient people, it is impacting us in many ways. And so, like Pastor mentioned, resilience being this double-edged sword, and what it is doing to us overall, I think is important for us to at least be aware of as we navigate this term of being that resilient people that just push through, and not finding strength in the erasure of our humanity and of our emotional and mental you know, issues. I
love that you said that. From a very personal place, I'm not speaking as Dr. Parker right now. Let's just play it on Carmen. What's up, y'all? I am tired. I am barely a year out of training, and I have been beat down so much with just nonsense, trying to be a colleague, show up to these spaces. To Pastor Upshaw's comment, you've got communities counting on you. I show up to workspaces with a 100-pound backpack of just toxic nonsense on my shoulders. And I'm already contemplating leaving my job. Like, what do you do when you recognize that your resilience is not worth the cost it's costing you? Like, how do you dial it down? Medicine needs to hear what I'm trying to say, but I'm looking at my kids in my newly single status, trying to raise them. And, you know, I'm reaching out for new employment. Like, what do you do when you realize that you are tired to the core, and it's because you are Black in a space where everyone else just gets to cruise? And for all the we cares and everything else, who's actually going to protect my salary so I can do some resilience, right? Are you gonna pay? Before I firmly leave Yale, I'm going to the CEO to try to express this. And I think it's even worse because now we have a grand rounds on anti-racism every 5 minutes. I am tired of white folks talking about anti-racism. Can you just pay me? I'm just can we skip the grand rounds? No, you don't need to pay the grand rounds speaker. You can just pay me right here. I'm tired. And so now, especially in this pandemic of racism, who's just gonna pay me? Can we stop talking about it? Can we just do something? I'm here, I'm stressed out, I'm waving the white flag, I'm trying to be your colleague, guys, but I'm going under because society's so toxic. And we just gonna talk about it as I leave the department and coast on to the sunset. That is the type of double standard that I think is hurting my resilience worse. I think I'm more burned out talking about anti-racism than when white folks were just doing it and not saying they're trying to do better.
I think it also, and thank you for sharing that, because, you know, in the pastoral space, that 100-pound backpack is there as well. Because you know, to a certain extent, you do become all things to all people. And I think that's one thing that's unique to the Black church experience that sometimes our suburban counterparts don't really understand. You take on that burden because you want your people to do well. I think part of it might be qualifying what healthy resilience looks like, and healthy resilience doesn't, you know, there's a way to adapt. There's a way to respond. There's a way to express what you're going through. And that's part of actually being resilient, right? Because we're no good to anyone if we're completely broken and downtrodden. I think part of the conversation is sometimes we say resilience is, you know, just holding it in. But a willow tree bends, right? An oak tree breaks. You know, you get enough, you know, pressure, you know, the wrong type of tree is not going to survive. It's going to be uprooted. And I think we have the opportunity, once again, in the space of ministry, to be able to cultivate a culture, right, where people can express. I know for me, so we, you know, I mentioned, Jess mentioned in my introduction about our space, right? We own a 65,000 square foot property. We have commercial tenants on the first floor. On the second floor, we have our worship space, but we're intentionally trying to cultivate community space because people need a place that they can come to where there's peace. You know, they need a place where they can come to where everybody knows their name, right? You walk in, you have some shared experiences, but it's in creating those therapeutic spaces that you have conversations where you are honest about what you're going through and you're honest about the difficulties that you're facing. And my concern is, once again, I'm not one of those anti-technology people. Like before I was a pastor, I led digital media for the Apollo Theater, like, you know, videographer, you know, used to do web development, all of that stuff. But it's becoming harder and harder for people to connect in real community. And even in spaces where you might have people who are willing to listen, because we have to work so hard to develop places of trust and peace. You know, my concern is that we'll be so siloed in our virtual worlds that what we're actually looking for, we can't find, because it's only found when we put the phones down and get to a place where we come back to physical spaces where I can look at you. You know, that's a pastoral gift. I can look at someone and say, you're like, what are you going through? Oh, I'm fine. Like, nah, come here. Let's sit down. Let's like really talk about this, because there's a physical aspect to relationship. And, you know, I think part of it is just creating those honest spaces for, you know, Dr. Parker, for you to say, you know, I'm tired. You know, I'm tired. I'm tired of people having me explain this and that. You know, I think there's spaces that at the community level, we can create where people can express that. And that's step one of not breaking. And then also understanding that our expression, even of leadership and helping people, is fluid. Nobody's asking us to be Superman. There might be societal pressure for you to be, but you don't have to be that, right? And in my context, you know, there's only one Christ. He died on the cross. You know, I'm not superhuman. You know, I trust in one who is divine. But for me, you know, I need grace. I need strength. I need help, right, to do that. And it's okay to say I need help.
My next question, we mentioned racial trauma a couple times for our prior questions, but we never really got into like what that is exactly. So my question for anyone is, what is racial trauma and how is it different from trauma in general?
Yeah, I can, you know, contribute to that. When we talk about racial trauma, we're talking about any emotional, psychological, or physical distress that an individual experiences based on their racial identity. So what negative encounters might one have based on their racial identity that then has a mental, physical, or psychological impact, and how that can, I don't want to use the word worsen, but certainly impact negatively one's mental health or physical health, really. And so even thinking about racial trauma, it's not just on the individual level. It's not just about what negative racial encounter might I experience. That's certainly one level, but we see the very same distress or symptoms of racial trauma happening even for community members who are hearing about stories, who are seeing it on the internet, who are not necessarily connected to other individuals that might be victims themselves, but that communal piece of who we are, and knowing that when we talk about race, we all share that same skin color. And so today it might be you, tomorrow it can very much be me, particularly when we look at hashtags and all these sorts of things and the fear that comes from that. And so it's not just negative racial experiences or encounters as Tiffany, but also in this group, how your experiences also bear weight on me as well. And so there are many people who feel just as deeply for an Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, or name Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, as if they were family members, as if they were friends. And so that really speaks to the communal impact of racial trauma that it has on us as a collective.
I also think it's important to talk about professional racial trauma, since we're sitting in a room of future lawyers and all professionals, and I need each and every one of y'all's numbers and what state you're practicing in, because getting a Black lawyer is like getting calorie-free cake. Somebody better stay in touch with me, for the record. So for this space, professional racial trauma, gaslighting, personally speaking, has been one of the hardest parts of enduring. 5% of lawyers are Black women, yet Black faculty in medicine are 3%. So we're one big body of brothers and sisters. We're right there struggling together. So give ourselves a hand, because we are all in this together, and y'all better give me your contact info. I'm still not kidding about that. So the worst part, I feel, is showing up in spaces where we are the underdog through very intentional, ongoing, systematic reasons that decrease our representation in spite of best efforts. When you see racial injustice, for me, the hardest part is hearing people explain why it wasn't. That is just hard. Or in medicine, when we're talking about racial disparities, Dr. Llewellyn, to your point that we feel it as if it could be our kin, if it could be our people. For a very recent Grand Rounds speech, they were talking about communities of color enduring ongoing racism and dying in a very detached, academic, cerebral, like they were in the autopsy suite having a completely objective, non-emotional discussion of dead Black folks. And I not so gently raised my hand in the Zoom and said that. I am very tired of studies to the point of racial trauma. I'm tired of studies talking about our trauma performed by people who aren't in our community, have no emotional investment, might as well be figuring out how to change a tire, right? For all of the emotional closeness that it impacts them personally. And then having to be Dr. Parker in these spaces when I'm thinking of myself, my loved one, my own brother died partially due to medicine delayed his surgery too long and his brain herniated in the meantime. So when we're talking about poor outcomes for Black folks, I'm thinking of my brother. So as you guys go on to your legal professions, having a language, we've talked about that today. Don't let people take your language away from you, because they will try. Reach out to me if you need me. But don't let people find cherry-picked, objective, non-racial reasons to explain an injustice that you know darn well is not right. That is racial trauma to me, the part where they hope I'm as ignorant as they're treating me.
For a follow-up question to that, On May 25th, 2020, as we all know, George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis police officer. Like many high-profile police killings, George Floyd's murder was displayed on major news network, and viral videos of his killings were shared all across social media. Is the spread of graphic images showing the death of Black men and women a mental health hazard? What are the ramifications of witnessing Black bodies being killed by authority figures on video?
Yes, it is a mental health hazard. I get this question literally all the time. And I often wonder, and I ask all the time, you know, I have friends who they can sit and watch the video of all almost 9 minutes of it, or every video that just pops up on our timeline, because there's just so much. And there's no way that, you know, we can sit and watch people who look like us be killed and it not have some impact on our mind, some impact on our bodies and our emotions, right? Like, it's just not natural to always be in that state of watching yourself in many ways just recklessly die. And so I also think, even when we think about the brain, and so by watching, the memories that get, you know, imprinted on your mind. And a lot of times when people are having flashbacks, people have nightmares. A lot of times when we assess racial trauma, people have a lot of difficulty sleeping. And so a lot of that is also visual, and it's also what we're inputting, and how it remains attached to our minds, how it increases anxiety and stress, not just in our minds, but in our bodies. And so now, based on what we watch, when we are in a similar position or a situation where we might feel like, am I now going to be another victim? Am I now going to be microaggressed in some ways? You know, even how we're showing up in spaces is already tense. It's already set to fight, or freeze or flight. You know, it's already set in this way, and that comes from what we're inputting. And so I think it's really important for us to monitor how much of this information we input, because it's not just watching. It's certainly going to land. And when it lands, what then is the ongoing impact on you? So I think it's really, really important to be able to set limits or boundaries around how much you're going to have input in your mind. And sometimes I think, or I wonder if, for those who watch videos, is it like to confirm? You know, sometimes you hear a story, a police officer knelt on the man's neck for almost 9 minutes, and that sounds absurd, right? Like, it sounds so inhumane that there's no way that we are being treated in this way. And sometimes I wonder if the desire to watch some of the videos is almost, I have to confirm that my people are treated so inhumane in our society. And so even being aware of what are the motivations to even watch some of the subjects and the things that we do as well.
I think what happens is, and what I see is a cycle and a pattern that I think is not healthy. You know, I'm the type of person, I don't have cable. I refuse to watch 24-hour news cycles. Just because a long time ago I decided that was what was best for me in terms of my own emotional health. Because somewhat, you know, I'm definitely not the type of person that's like, you know, escape reality, don't know what's going on. I find other ways to be informed. I think so much of the news has become entertainment in the worst way. There's a pattern now of something happens, people are split and divided on their perspectives because we have such a polarized society where people pick sides immediately based on their political preference or, ethnic or racial lines. Some people watch the video because they want to see it for themselves so they can be informed to have an opinion based on what they saw versus, you know, what others are saying. And then we have this new culture, which is a reaction culture, where there are social media influencers who get hundreds of thousands of views because they do a split screen where they have the event that happened and then they watch it, then they talk about it. And then everybody in the news cycle is talking about it. And I think it's an unhealthy environment, because what happens is not only are we seeing the trauma, the visual moment, you can't unsee that. You can't unsee George Floyd with his knee, with a knee on his neck for 9 minutes. You can't unsee that. There's no way that mentally you can wipe that image from your brain. It's not Men in Black where somebody comes out with a little device and flashes your memory and it's gone. It's there, it's with you. But then you have to see it over and over again with the commentary of people that you don't know, who have some level of influence, who are shaping the minds of people. And I think that part is becoming exhausting as well, because you know that there are going to be some personalities that speak up, and you're going to have your conservative voices and your more liberal voices, and everybody's going to be talking at each other. And now this is going to become a conversation piece. And so not only are you going to see it over and over again, but you're going to hear everybody's take on it. So by the time you get exhausted, you've heard 100 takes on it. You've seen the video another 50 times. And you're trying to say, okay, where do I stand with this? Because there's so much stimuli and so much input. I'm concerned I don't have any type of, clinical backing X, Y, and Z. What happens to the brain when we constantly see this stuff over and over again? You're getting pings and notifications, and all of it is bad news. It's got to do something to your psyche. It's got to do something to your soul and something to your spirit. So I think that there has to be a conversation. When do you turn it off? When do you disengage from social media? So much activism is connected to social media. I'm not sure if that's really a good thing. And I think as a pastor, as someone who's on the ground working with people and dealing with a diversity of people with different opinions on things, you see the way people are responding and how they're absorbing. And I don't believe it's healthy, because now you're taking on the anger, the frustration, the pain, the trauma. It's not just your trauma now. Now you're taking on other people's trauma and other people's trauma and other people's trauma. We're not built to be able to handle all of that. And then when you go home, you're lying in your bed and you're scrolling to see, what else. It's not healthy at all.
I think it's a double-edged sword to all of your absolute points. I personally don't even have social media. I'm a millennial, proudly without social media. I don't want to be bothered. I've got enough stress as it is. But I also think to this trendy racism pandemic, Dr. Llewellyn, to your point of having to prove it, I think that now that non-Black folks are seeing what we're going through, because technology lets us do the trauma images on, you pulled over, you whip out your FaceTime live recording because something might go down and my family needs to be able to arm themselves. So I think no one cared when Black folks were saying it on our own 2 feet with our own voice. We were lynched, we were dangled from trees, we were shot, we were expelled from school, we were reprimanded with professionalism standards at work. We couldn't say it on our own devices because the systems of oppression, if you don't pleasantly swallow your discrimination, the system is designed to shut you up through different means. So I think this inundation with social media, while I personally will not ever watch someone's murder, I'm not turned on Twitter, but I think to raise a critical conscious awareness, to my point previously, that, our colleagues who are on the fence of whether what we're saying is true or not, or the ones who need to believe in a just world who aren't Black, like Dr. Llewellyn, if we ourselves are trying to swallow it, imagine what someone who's been living in a white picket sheltered fence their whole life, right? And then to Dexter Upshaw, you get the ones who endorse the status quo through the law and order. Well, the Black man, when he was pulled over for the 72nd time that month, he should have just acted all nicely and he should have done this instead of, you get that camp. Like, it's the idea that white folks can tolerate discrimination better than us because they would have just, yes, here you go, here's my license. Like, it's fascinating. So I think we need the social media to get the borderline people ready to hear what we've been saying at 400 years, trying not to get lynched and reprimanded. But to the flip side, for those of us who already know and don't need it to be informed, knowing limits is going to be what we have to do for ourselves.
So I have two more questions, and I want to leave at least 10 minutes now for like anybody in the group that wants to ask. But before I do that, one of those questions is, well, first a comment. The prolific writer and activist Stephen Baldwin once said that to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. In a lot of ways, it seems that being angry or having the sense of like righteous anger has been the driving force behind a lot of social movements that's led to constructive changes in America. Take, for example, the civil rights movement. Is being in a constant state of rage good? Is being angry all the time a sacrifice that we have to make, bear with in order to see positive changes in America?
I think injustice is going to evoke something, right? And anger in and of itself is not inherently negative. I'm sure the pastor can speak to the text about be angry but sin not, etc. And so I think that when we think about the history and the current realities of living in a racist society, it's hard not to get angry, particularly when that continued dehumanization, denial of your experiences, just the gaslighting that happens, the inability to see you. I mean, it evokes something. I don't see anger so much of the issue or the negative thing, but what do we do with our anger? How do we channel our anger into change? How do we channel it into productive activism that changes the system? I know that there's a old African proverb, West African proverb, that says the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And so when we say that Black people are angry, what exactly are we saying? And how are we contextualizing their anger? And then often when I work with people and they say that they're angry, and I feel anger, there are emotions beneath anger, right? And so are we just angry, or are there fears attached to that anger? Is there worry and sadness of our circumstances attached to that anger? And how can we, in light of this entire conversation around mental health, process and identify some of those other emotions and utilize the anger to channel it towards change, towards action, towards advocacy, towards making our voices heard, and all the different layers in which we can channel that. And I heard one of my students say it really beautifully, that with rage, thinking of it as a power plant, not as a bomb that explodes, but how can we channel that energy into something that's sustained and is long-term? And so I think that's a really good way to think about what do we do with Black rage, not to dismiss it, but to certainly help our people process it, be okay with it, but channel it in a way that sustains us and helps us move forward and progress.
The short answer is a person's emotional wellness cannot be sustained in the persistent anger, rage all the time. I don't think so personally, because that rage flows into almost everything that you do, and it makes it difficult to manage relationships. What I found is that in my own life, if I'm angry about something and I allow that anger to consume me, it's very hard to delineate the target. So my kids are like, "What did I do?" And it's because if I've allowed anger to burn, it's kind of hard for it not to burn those who are closest to you. And so I think there are some very key considerations when it comes to how we process our emotions. It is natural to feel a certain type of way. Emotions are human. And the sacred scriptures in the New Testament for me and my worldview say, be angry, but sin not. But we're also taught to get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling, and slander. I think if you look historically at the civil rights movement, there's always been different perspectives on how to affect change. There are some who say, well, you know, turning the other cheek, forgiveness, we've done that enough. It hasn't gotten us anywhere. You know, letting the rage burn is a way to get folks' attention. I can respectfully disagree, but I can understand why someone would have that perspective in light of everything that has continued to happen historically. I think if we're dealing with the emotional health of people, if we're dealing with mental health in people, I think we have to help them process their anger into something that is constructive, or else we're going to create this pathology that's going to pass on, because once again, you can't burn with anger and it not burn those who are closest to you. You know, to go back to that question about kind of like the stoic image of generations that came before us, or Black men, you know, for those Black men who were going to the plant, working every day, their hard work wasn't acknowledged. People were taking credit for what they were doing. You know, sometimes they got home and they were so drained, they had nothing to give to their kids, you know, or they felt like, you know, I did what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to provide, put a roof over your head. That's, you know, I always think of August Wilson's Fences, you know, and this contrast, but the father didn't have the emotional tools to be able to connect with his son. So the only thing he could do was push rage into him because of his own lack of fulfilled desires due to the world and society that was in. You know, I don't want my son growing up saying daddy couldn't relate. Daddy was so consumed with this crazy world of ministry because I'm absorbing everybody else's problems and counseling everybody else. And then to be able to come home and not provide for my kids what they need. So I think there has to be a real conversation about strategy, right? To take, and I think that West African proverb, I think that was mentioned in Black Panther, if I'm not.
Oh, was it? Oh, yeah. It was, right? And there are these things, you know, that come up about, you know, how do you fight the fight? But I've made the resolve in my own heart, you know, what good is it for me to save the world and to lose my kids? Isn't part of the struggle like raising up healthy kids who far exceed my ability to make an impact, who will become future leaders and who need to be healthy leaders and who need to be a part of changing the landscape. You know, maybe one of my children, one of my 3 kids, I just had another, I didn't have a baby, my wife did, it contributed to the process, right? But we have a 3rd child. She's 5 weeks old. You know, maybe she's supposed to go into, you know, psychology, or maybe she's supposed to go into counseling, and maybe she's going to be a voice in the space where that's necessary. But how can she get there if I'm not there to provide for her? So I think there's always this tension of, okay, how much goes to the movement? How much of the movement is at home? To once again, create spaces where kids can grow up in a healthy environment. Because if we don't do that, then certain things perpetuate. The last thing I want to say is that there are external factors that are dealing with our mental health and emotional health, but we can't ignore some of the things that are happening internally in terms of family cycles and things that have been passed on from one generation to the next, and unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict, anger, commitment to family. And a lot of folks that I'm dealing with, you know, they are dealing with things that they didn't get from their mother. They're dealing with conversations that were never had with their father. They are dealing with things very deeply seated hurts from things they observed growing up that have never been addressed. They're dealing with, you know, molestation and folks in their family who didn't speak up for them, and they're carrying that around. And so there's also this work that we're doing internally as we fight the things externally. And I say all that to say, which is why I'm a believer, because I know we're going to need some help beyond what we have in our hands to be able to deal with this. But I do genuinely believe that there is hope if we can work at the family level. We can work with the children and develop these healthy cultures where people can deal with their emotional issues and have a healthy resilience. Because in some respects, my own personal viewpoint is that sometimes you cannot change the world and the way the world perceives you, but you can create cultures. You can create communities. You can participate in communities. If I can handle my church and the families I have influence with, we can handle this block, this neighborhood that we're in, and connect with the families across the street and connect with the folks around us, then we are making an impact for those folks. And if everyone does that, then maybe we'll be able to deal with these larger societal issues, but it starts at home.
I'm personally burned out of anger. I'm burned out in general. Again, 1 year out of training. I think anger / righteous indignation is a great way to light a fire. Jesus turned over the tables in the temple because of righteous indignation. So to the analogy of anger tunneled into change and movement, I'm for it. To your point, Pastor Upshaw, of having enough left over of yourself for your children and being willing to take a hard look at what you're currently doing, and if you don't have enough left over for your kids so they can go succeed and be healthy, well-adjusted, being willing to change that and make whatever personal sacrifices you have to be present for your kids. But also within medicine, I'm also burned out of anger because there's so much racism. It's slapping me in the face every day. Even the trope of the angry Black person in psychiatry, we call that psychosis. And the first advertisements for antipsychotics actually had an angry Black Panther on the advertisement saying, if you have an angry Black man, try some haloperidol, it's great. So psychiatry has even pathologized the angry Black person. So I can't even get angry, right? So where I'm at personally is I'm motivated, but I would like to work with people to change. Like, I'm frustrated because all the people who say we want to do better in medicine, in the legal field, and personal aspects, then help me help you. Why do I have to get angry to get us there? Why do I have to be on level 10, see an injustice and convince people that it's actually an injustice? Can we not like hold each other's hands and let me help you stop killing Black folks without me having to get to the anger stage to spur some type of reaction? Or can we just drop the part where you care? Because if I have to get angry, then you honestly don't really care. And there's not enough anger in me to change medicine, change the field of mental health, and still be present for my kids. So if I can't help medicine grow in my somewhat utopian daydream of holding someone's hand, walking side by side to face injustice, as opposed to the angry Black woman who needs Haldol because obviously if she's not happy in society, there's something biologically wrong with her thought process. I'm out of anger, guys. I'm out of anger.
My final question before I leave it up for anyone who, if anyone was like, my final question is, what are helping coping skills that we can all apply in our lives to cope with emotional distress, and when should someone seek mental health care from a professional?
I tell people, I think everyone needs to talk to a therapist, a counselor, a support individual who's trained to help you navigate, process, or just kind of make sense of your situation at least one time. Go one time, and if you don't need it, then you don't. But I do think that engaging those spaces is going to be critical to long-term sustainability, to managing those feelings of burnout, and just feeling overwhelmed and frustrated and everything else that comes up. I think it's really important. I think in terms of tools, ensuring that you have some sort of wellness plan. Staying well and being well does not happen. It doesn't just happen. It's certainly going to take some preparation and some planning and some awareness of where do you feel most triggered? Who do you feel most triggered around? Understanding what brings that up for you. Understanding, those spaces that tend to impact your mental health or your personhood deeply, those spaces where you feel most wounded. Understanding that can help you with navigating, having a plan before you end up in crisis, having a plan before you end up stressed out, having a plan before you are burnt out. And sticking to your plan and being aware of what does your life look like when you are well? What does your life look like when you are stable or at a space where you feel good mentally, physically, overall? What is in your context? Who are the people? Who's your tribe? Where are the spaces that keep you at a place of feeling well? So that when you are not in that space, that's your signal that you're not doing well. And so how can you get back to your baseline? And then specifically around the conversation of Black mental health or racial trauma, I like to say staying physically healthy is going to be critical because of the external weight that is already impacting our bodies. We have to give ourselves a fighting chance, and staying physically healthy is a part of that. Taking breaks from social media is also important. Connecting with individuals and organizations that affirm, see you, value your personhood and your humanity, particularly at times like this. Listening to your gut about the spaces that are not safe, the people that are not safe, especially if you feel like you're having to do so much teaching in moments like this, that is so exhausting in and of itself. Are those people safe? Are those spaces safe? Rest and restoration, I like to say, are acts of resistance. This idea that we have to keep going and beyond 100% of the time, I do not subscribe to. And so taking breaks is a restorative act. Focusing on where you can, really create change. Is it in your family? Is it at your school? Is it at your workplace, in your community? Because sometimes racism and systemic change feels so large and abstract. And being able to find those tangible ways to create change can help. Giving yourself permission to feel whatever comes up for you when you think about injustice, and validating and listening to each other. So creating spaces like this helps. It's a part of the process and tool. One breath at a time, one step at a time, and systems and people who don't get it don't define us. And so how can we continue to rehumanize and build up ourselves and our communities so that we are moving progress forward, are just some of the tools and steps that I share.
Thank you, Dr. Llewellyn.
That was such a good list.
I've got nothing to add. Get it, girlfriend.
I would say, from my perspective, for me personally, based on my relationship with God through Christ, there's a greater sense of calling that keeps me going. And in those times where I feel overwhelmed, where I want to, cut somebody out, it's really my worldview and my perspective of Scripture that helps me to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. There's in the Old Testament scriptures, there's a text that's really dear to my heart about Nehemiah, who rebuilt the walls of his community, and having to deal with the harassment of other ethnic groups that did not want him to finish this work. And just remembering that he had been called to good work and keeping his hands to that good work. So I think to a certain extent, for me, having a greater faith helps me to be able to take a step back and put things into perspective. In addition to all the things that Dr. Llewellyn mentioned, we got to take those times to step back and to retreat and to process. Turning off the phones. I just did it today. I got to the place where I took my email off of my phone. Facebook, took those notifications off. YouTube notifications, all these pings and dings. We got to take time to really think for ourselves and to set aside spaces, grab a journal, grab books. And also I'll say this, if you have loved ones in your life, take time for them. Look them in the eyes, spend time investing in relationship, because tomorrow is not promised, but you have an opportunity to create spaces of peace that are contrary to what you see out there. Make it your passion to make sure that you're not going to be the very things that are antagonizing you, and work really, really hard to demonstrate that love to those who are closest to you in the midst of a world that doesn't share those values.
Thank you, Pastor Dexter.
Just something to add about the deleting your social media and your emails. That's really not far-fetched, because I was watching a Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma, and one of the